Good evening, everyone. I know it's been a really long day packed with different kinds of conversations, discussions, and many zigzag patterns must be going on in our minds. But you will have to bear with us for another 15 minutes or so, which is getting you into yet another complex subject, which is on masculinities. हिंदी में मर्दानगी बोलते हैं. और we thought that we would like to share some of our work that happened during the course of 2 years to put out this report. I first would like to acknowledge the support of Edelgive Foundation for giving us the opportunity to delve into a subject that is much less researched, and we feel that it's necessary that we can read from this and look at the ways forward, especially groups that are working with women rights organizations, also groups that are working with masculinities. We would like to figure out if there are ways in which we can keep the approach intersectional. So I'm going to try my best to keep it very brief. We do have a copy of the report printed, which will be available for circulation to all of you. You can take a copy of it tomorrow when you enter at the registration desk. Let me just introduce Maraa a little bit to you. So Maraa means tree in Kannada. Maraa is pronounced as Maraa, not Mara. Many people often think it's maybe we are saying something wrong when we say Maraa, which also means death in Hindi, and we don't have a problem with that. There's also many meanings of Maraa. In Malayalam, it means tree. Also in Manipuri, it means roots. So it has many meanings, and also means demon, I think, in Pali, because it's a reference to the demon who distracted Buddha. So you can imagine we are quite of all these things. But yeah, I think we believe, I think, in the power of stories. And for us, media and arts has a huge role in challenging inequality, injustice, and discrimination. So most of our work is not with any particular issue, but we work closely with, we really believe in the spirit of the arts and also different kinds of media that can kind of at least challenge these existing discriminatory systems that we live in. Our effort is obviously to bring to the fore those voices that are systematically suppressed. We also try to create platforms for freedom of speech and expression in different kinds of spaces. So I think I'll just move into why we did this report. Why we did this report and where we started. So we've been around since 2008. We've been working with different feminist organizations across the country, and we've learned a lot, I would say, from the contribution of various organizations that have been working on the ground tirelessly, trying out different ways to think of how violence against women could end. And it's not like work is over. I think kaam abhi jari hai. I feel that what we learned from our friends and well-wishers is that, you know, that work on masculinities is not separate from that of anything that women's rights organizations are doing. It's very integral to what they're already doing. It's part of it. It's not something like a separate project or a separate, we don't need to set up a whole different organization to do work on masculinities. And we also feel that there have been some very relevant arguments from feminist groups about organizations led by men who probably are in a more privileged space, who do, without kind of acknowledging, I think, the significant changes within what work has been done. So there seems to be a bit of a push and pull issue there. And I think there have also been groups who've been working only on masculinities who feel like they've not, their work is not looked at as feminist. So there's this clash between how do we think of masculine and feminine? How do we look at this, this simultaneity of the two existing? I feel that for us, when we started doing this work, I think one of our efforts was to see that these two areas of work don't need to be exclusive. They don't need to be treated like two separate areas of work. In fact, we thought it would be a better idea to look at work that has already been done so far and try and see what kind of blind spots we might be finding within the scope of work that we've achieved so far. Um, yeah, so I think now we'll move straight to the presentation. All the paintings in this book are specially made by our friend Rumi Harish, who is a trans man and an activist based in Bangalore. He's also a writer, a theatre practitioner, and a musician, and many, many things. So we hope that the paintings allow us to imagine masculinities in a slightly more, in a different way compared to what the content is saying in the report. So yeah, the first slide is really about what is masculinities. We thought we'd do a participative exercise, but I think it's enough. We'll just try and keep it very brief. We just thought that we'll just tell you what we learned from the conversations we had with the researchers we worked with. Angarika will be getting into the methodology, but essentially we think what we arrived at was that masculinities is something that is born out of a repetitive nature of doing one thing over and over again. This is not limited only to men. It is also it is associated probably with men, but it's not limited only to men, which means that even women and other genders embody a degree of masculinity in them. Of course, it is a performance, because not every time we are not in situations where we are afraid to do something by not conforming. So we have to keep performing these roles over and over again, so that we feel like we are part of this order, we are part of this herd. And it's not an individual choice. It may not be my choice to behave like this, but I end up behaving like this because the social structure validates that. And the other thing that's very important is that masculinity is not just one kind. It's not. It's based on where you are. Your masculinity will change. So, for example, let's take the example of a worker who's a male worker. Now, the male worker faces different forms of discrimination, either from the contractor to the employer to, I don't know, higher management. So the way in which he behaves in different contexts will be different, and his masculinity will play out differently in different contexts. So we do look at it as, yeah, as I said, that after thinking about these things, we felt that it was necessary to kind of go into the root causes of masculinity rather than thinking about, how do we make programs? How do we design programs? So we had to study the design, but we also felt like it was necessary to go into the causes of what is the cause for the construction of masculinities in our society. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Angarika to continue.
Okay. So I think we worked on this study for close to 2 years, and now I have the very daunting task of trying to present it to you in 10 minutes, but I'll try and do my best. Just broadly, these were the objectives that we began working with, and as Ekta kind of mentioned, one of the first things that we did was to do a very extensive review of the approaches that were being used within the development sector on masculinity, and it was really nice to see some of the organizations that I had spoken to present over here, and we would really like to give you a copy of the report, because the study was greatly informed by their insights and their reflections and very honest sharing of their challenges. And something that we kept hearing from everyone was that it's impossible to engage boys and men. Programs on masculinity don't last very long. It's challenging to get funding for masculinity work. And that kind of made us think that perhaps we need to broaden the scope of what we're considering as masculinity. This is a challenge because, of course, if you're working on women's rights, it's kind of a clear correlation that you would be working with women and that you're a feminist organization or a women's rights organization. But if you're working on masculinities, then what exactly are you working on and how exactly do you kind of name it? There is a conceptual challenge, I think, in trying to understand what masculinity is. So I guess the first objective was to try and see if we could broaden the scope of masculinity programs beyond just boys and men. I think the second was, as Ekta mentioned, what are the causes of masculinity? So Of course, we've been through this with our understanding of gender. It's neither natural nor innate, nor premised only on a binary of sex. So how do we really understand where masculinity emerges from? Is it spatial? Does it come from specific cultural context? Does it come from the biology of men? So what are the different causes of masculinity, and how can we understand that? The third was to really move. I'm just going to the fourth point, but it was to really move beyond behavior change, because we felt that a lot of programs, of course, it is important if men start washing dishes and share decision making and participate more in family life, but I don't think that we can limit the scope of challenging masculinity to just that. And we did feel that in a lot of programs there was a lot of undue space also being taken up by these kinds of individual transformatory actions of men, which kind of put a lot of pressure on men to be some kind of an ideal male, and also kind of push back women into being only wives or sisters or daughters that are receiving this kind of transformative masculinity. So we felt it was necessary to move beyond only behavior change. And I think the most significant point, which sounds perhaps obvious when we say it, but requires, I think, a lot of deep thought, is that all men are not the same, just as all women are not the same. And something that we found missing, or perhaps not researched enough in a lot of programmatic approaches, was the way in which caste, class, religion, sexuality, geographical context, linguistic context, how that shapes masculinity, and the fact that we can't consider masculinity to just be static. It's not just one thing that you can go and tackle, but how do we understand how power runs through the concept of masculinity? Yeah, that was that point as well. Okay, so very briefly, I want to mention our methodology, because we really struggled with the methodology. How do you really kind of try and figure out how to map this? So as I mentioned, there was a literature review of literature that was produced by the sector, followed by interviews with women's rights organizations. And then I think one of the things that we really felt was that most of the work on masculinities we felt was situated in a very particular community context, largely the experiences of marginalized communities. So we felt it was very important to have a diversity of perspectives on masculinity. So we asked 12 of our friends from different parts of the country. We intentionally chose not to work with researchers, because we feel that with researchers then comes the baggage of training. So we work with friends who are in the media sector, who are activists, who are community workers, who are artists, and they're all from scattered in different parts, and they are across a diversity of caste, class, geographical, sexuality spectrum. And we asked them to just write about how they see masculinity in their everyday lives. So we would have monthly workshops where we would share back notes, and the only thing that we asked them to do was just kind of keep a very detailed log of how they were perceiving the way in which masculinity was either forming or breaking. That has kind of formed the crux of the study. It's in the executive summary, there are only very small excerpts of the ethnographies, but we do hope to release the longer report as well, and that has very detailed ethnographies in terms of how people responded to that in their daily lives. We also made an effort to co-analyze the data with them, because I think what happens often is that researchers मतलब research करते हैं और data देते हैं और फिर कोई और उसको बाहर से analyze करता है, and there's kind of a power hierarchy over there. So we try to involve them in the co-analysis of the data. And finally, we felt it was also important to write ourselves in. So there are also accounts from members of Maraa about masculinity. So that was kind of broadly the methodology. You want to, maybe I'll finish this and then we can, yeah. I've kind of said most of this, but I'm just running over it again, which is when we spoke. So we spoke to close to, I think, between 25 to 30 organizations. Some of them are part of the Edelgive network, but some of them were also not. And these are organizations ranging from very small organizations to fairly large organizations. We also spoke to organizations who've been funding work on masculinity. So we tried our best to speak to a cross section of people. Of course, it's not exhaustive, because it can never be, but this is broadly kind of what we gleaned as our analysis of their approach. So we did feel that there was a lot of emphasis on boys and men, men and boys, without any kind of qualification as to which men and which boys we're talking about. Most of the approaches are limited to addressing violence against women. This is, of course, very necessary work, but we just feel that it limits the scope of inquiry if we're looking at women as victims and men as perpetrators. So how can we also look beyond that? The evidence base was mostly men from marginalized communities. This we felt was a little bit of a problem because when we talk about masculinities, we're also talking about dominant masculinities, and that may not be coming from working class, lower caste, religious minority backgrounds. It also comes from upper caste, upper class, dominant communities. So how do we find a way to, get perspectives from across the spectrum? Um, Intergenerational gaps. So a lot of people, a lot of field workers actually shared very interesting and difficult challenges about engaging young men in their programs. They felt like young men are not interested in listening or they leave programs. But when we reviewed the training curriculums, we felt maybe part of the reason is because a lot of the vocabulary perhaps does not speak to the cultural context that those boys are located in. Maybe sometimes we get comfortable to talk down to people as opposed to trying to figure out where their ideas are born from. So that's what we mean by intergenerational gaps. Language and vocabulary, this was a huge challenge for us also because easy to talk about many things in English, but when we're talking in Hindi or in Kannada or any of the other languages we were working in, how do you define masculinity? So very many different vocabularies began emerging from the researchers, which we feel is also an interesting thing to look at within trainings. And finally, we felt that, of course, the media and popular culture is to a large extent patriarchal, misogynist, but people also find themselves in media and popular culture, and I think it's important to be in sync with the media habits of people we're working with because we don't live life only offline anymore. That binary has kind of, I guess, vanished. um, yeah, so before we come to the last slide, which is the recommendations, so maybe we can go back, but I can't. So, oh, I did. Okay. Ekta and I just wanted to like very briefly share two excerpts from just two ethnographies. We're not going to read out the whole thing, but it's just a way of trying to illustrate all of what I just said. So this is a part of a story that a friend of ours called Ramesh. He's a very interesting person. He's a theatre artist in Indore in Madhya Pradesh, but he's also a life insurance agent and he's also a milkman. So he juggles like various hats depending on what time of the day it is. Ramesh is a father of two daughters, and he comes from a kind of dominant class and caste family, and also, I mean, his family is also fairly religious. So we had a lot of conversations and I mean, a lot of arguments also about Mardangi with him. And there's just one small excerpt that I wanted to share, which he's written as his reflections. So he said that, inspired by the clean shaven heroes of Hindi cinema, I have always wanted to shave my mustache. But each time I try, I face a lot of backlash from my family. They perceive the lack of a mustache to be a sign of emasculation. Maniki na mard ho. One of my older relatives, every time he would see me, would say, our mustache is our caste pride. Don't shave it. What does a mustache have to do with caste pride? I asked him. Why do you ask so many questions? Will you now start clapping at festivals? Will you start wearing a sari? These questions and this experience really traumatized me. It was only years later in the newspaper that I began to read about murders in and around where I live of Dalit men because they dared to grow their mustache. So this is just a small excerpt, but I think kind of hopefully reveals a little bit of what we were trying to say about different kinds of masculinity intersecting.
So, this is a dear friend also who's an activist, Suresh, who grew up in Kerala and has spent most of his life living and working in Bangalore with a quiet smile on his face. He always questions norms that restrict the expression of gender. He identifies as a trans man, and his journey has been difficult, lonely, and full of various different kinds of discrimination, and has finally decided to actually theorize what masculinity means for him. So I'm just going to read a small para. I've known many female assigned community people who shared with me their perceptions of the journey from I want to be a man to I am a man. In fact, we would often chat about how the process of gendering starts at home, the ideals of which would often clash with the idea of being a man inside us. This we enjoyed secretly, but also expressed ourselves in different ways. For me, it was a game of cricket. I started playing cricket with boys in the neighborhood streets. I would now say that the act of playing cricket was the first assertion of my masculinity. Usually, it is a male bastion sport according to the society. For me and many fellow trans masculine people, cricket is a way to assert our masculinity. My first assertion of masculinity manifested in working and taking roles of work outside the four walls of home and never engaging in the kitchen. During those times, the gender binary of feminine and masculine was ingrained in my head. Looking back, it was because of social morality.
So, I guess like what really got revealed from the ethnographies was that at any given moment in life there are multiple axes of masculinity, of vulnerability, of power, of privilege that seem to be intersecting. So it's difficult to just extract one thing as masculinity, which kind of brought us to what, now that we've said everything that could be better. Okay, yeah, we got the spelling of approach wrong. Is kind of the recommendations. Recommendations is a very big word because we also know that organizations have been working for years and decades on the field. So these are not so much recommendations, but just maybe like new ways of perhaps imagining or revising or refreshing the ways in which we work. Um, the first is I feel that we need perhaps new frameworks in how we think about masculinity. Of course, a feminist framework, but also something that we could emphasize is that a lot of the models of thinking about masculinity are borrowed from the West. And I think the South Asian experience of gender is very different. So, to try and consciously perhaps document the work that we're doing as various organizations and try and arrive at a South Asian framework for masculinities. Um, Similarly, there were a few organizations we spoke to who were doing a lot of research and evaluation work, who spoke a lot about the difficulty of evaluation mechanisms because they're often quantitative, target driven, action oriented, and you need more qualitative evaluation mechanisms. I think in the expanding programmatic scope, I've kind of already spoken about it, so I'm not going over like each point. And finally, of course, an appeal to donors to kind of rethink the way in which they, or expand the way in which they might think of masculinity programs and not frame it as only working with men and boys. Happy to talk about these recommendations with all of you in person. We're here for the next 2 days. But before ending, I just wanted to also really thank our advisory board who really helped us through this report. Aparna is here, so a big round of applause for Aparna. And also to Harish from Mava, Rekha Raj, and Maya Sharma, who really gave us very solid critique and insightful feedback without which we couldn't have done this report. And now this is kind of the way forward, but we could, which Aparna is going to kind of elaborate on. So invite Aparna to the stage to please comment further.
Thank you, Ekta and Angarika, for that lovely presentation. It was a lot of work to squeeze that into 15 minutes, but and thank you, Edelgive, for supporting this very important work. I just want to say a couple of quick things. I think this work has great value for two reasons. The first is it's done by a media collective. And what is the relevance of having work on masculinities being done by an arts and media collective? Much of masculinity and femininity is narrative, right? How do you build a narrative around a gender? And so, and the second piece of the second value, I think, is that it actually is an ethnographic study, very deep ethnographies. The report, the executive summary is this thin, but the depth of the ethnographies is so beautiful that I think just reading them will give you all a sensibility of how complex and layered this issue is. The third thing I think it's important for us to think about, for all of us in the development space who work on gender, whether you work on health, nutrition, education, all our work, gender is a very important axis that cuts across. And in the development space, we always think about gender where we can turn women into beneficiaries. I mean, that it tends to be the beginning and the end of the work that we do. But how do we bring the challenge of shifting and shaping masculinity into a way that we can bring about greater equality is what the challenge is. So this actually is extremely important for us to mainstream. So mainstreaming gender has just meant counting women. And I think the advantage of this report is going to be if we can figure out how we bring in this idea of masculinity. I'll end with a very quick story. in the temple in Chidambaram, where Shiva is the deity, there actually is a shrine where he's a midwife. He helps to deliver Ganesha. So he becomes a woman. Okay, and he's called Ammayappa. So he's a father who is as good as a mother. So I think we should think about masculinity also in its various complexities.